For millions, the sitcom Roseanne was the wholesome voice of working-class America. But behind the laughs, ABC was secretly funding Hollywood's most dangerous marriage. This is the drug-fueled nightmare of Roseanne and Tom Arnold, a billionaire tyrant, and her volatile husband who held a billion-dollar network hostage. They turned a beloved family set into a psychological war zone, firing writers for sport and smashing furniture in cocaine-fueled rages. And the network, they didn't stop. They paid millions to cover it up, actively choosing advertising revenue over human safety. The mother of America was, in reality, a corporate monster. This toxic empire didn't build itself overnight. The roots of this destructive partnership trace directly back to the exact power dynamic of 1988. When the sitcom first aired, it was not just a hit. It was a massive, instant cultural earthquake. The executives at the network realized overnight that they had a phenomenon on their hands. But the star of this show was not a trained Hollywood actress who was used to following orders from men in suits. She came from the rough, male-dominated world of stand-up comedy. She had spent her entire life fighting to be heard, sleeping in cheap motels, and dealing with club owners who tried to cheat her out of her pay. She carried a deep, lingering trauma of always feeling like an outsider, a person the elite class looked down upon. When she arrived in Hollywood and signed her contracts, that trauma did not disappear. It was magnified. She felt the network executives viewed her as a crude, uneducated woman who just got lucky. She felt they wanted to sanitize her voice and turn her into a safe, easily controlled product. This created a massive chip on her shoulder. She realized very quickly that the entire show and the hundreds of millions of dollars it generated relied completely on her face and her voice. She knew she held all the leverage, and she decided to use it to punish the corporate system that she felt constantly disrespected her. She was terrified of losing control, so she decided to control everything. It was during this period of intense paranoia and newfound overwhelming power that Tom Arnold entered the picture. Tom was another stand-up comedian from the exact same gritty club circuit, but his career was not experiencing a meteoric rise. He was struggling to find his footing, and more importantly, he was fighting a severe out-of-control dependency on chemical substances. His life was erratic, heavily driven by the extreme highs and crushing lows of his habits. When Roseanne and Tom started their relationship, it was not a traditional Hollywood romance. It was a collision of two profoundly damaged people who recognized the exact same chaos and class resentment in each other. They bonded over a shared hatred of the Hollywood establishment. Roseanne felt isolated and paranoid at the top of her television empire. She felt surrounded by corporate suits who only wanted to exploit her talent and steal her money. Tom offered her something nobody else in that sterile studio environment did. He offered her blind, aggressive, unfiltered loyalty. He was loud, he was chaotic, and because of his substance issues, he was completely unafraid of the consequences. He did not care about Hollywood etiquette. Roseanne saw him as a weapon. She saw a man she could unleash against the producers and writers she hated. Tom, on the other hand, found an ultimate protector in Roseanne. He was a man whose life was spiraling downward, facing the very real prospect of losing everything to his addictions. In Roseanne, he found a woman who possessed so much industry power that she could completely shield him from the real world. They filled a dangerous void in each other. Roseanne gave Tom unlimited money, high status, and absolute protection from the consequences of his erratic behavior. Tom gave Roseanne the validation and the aggressive backup she craved to fight her daily wars on the studio lot. They formed a closed circle. It was an us against the world mentality. They convinced each other that everyone outside their relationship was an enemy trying to tear them down. By 1989, this toxic symbiosis reached its first critical turning point. Roseanne decided that she wanted Tom to work on her show permanently. She wanted him in the writer's room, and she wanted him given a role on screen. This is where the absolute cruelty and cowardice of the television industry truly revealed itself. The network executives knew exactly who Tom Arnold was. They had access to his background. They knew he was struggling with severe substance dependencies. They knew his behavior was deeply unpredictable and often hostile. Placing a person in that condition into a high-pressure, fast-paced television production is a recipe for a workplace disaster. The executives initially pushed back. They tried to keep Tom off the studio lot to protect their investment and maintain order on the set. They tried to draw a professional boundary, but a boundary only works if you are willing to enforce it. This is when Roseanne flexed her billion-dollar muscle. She did not negotiate with the network. She delivered a simple, devastating threat. She told the executives that if they did not hire Tom, give him an office, and put him on the payroll, she would walk out of the studio and refuse to film another episode. She put the entire franchise, the jobs of hundreds of crew members, and the network's Tuesday night revenue on the line for him. The executives were forced to make a decision that would set the tone for the rest of the decade. They had to choose between maintaining a safe professional workplace or protecting their massive advertising revenue. The system in Hollywood is entirely driven by profit. The executives sat in their boardrooms and ran the numbers. They looked at the soaring ratings, and they chose the money. They caved to her demands completely and unconditionally. They opened the studio gates and let a volatile, unpredictable man walk right into the control center of the #1 show in America. This decision sent a clear, terrible message to both Roseanne and Tom. The network essentially taught them that their behavior would never, ever be punished. It proved that as long as the sitcom made money, the couple could demand anything, break any rule, and force the network to swallow its pride. The executives traded their authority for cash, and by doing so, they handed the keys of the kingdom over to a couple who were rapidly losing touch with reality. Once Tom was officially on the payroll in 1989, the dynamic of the show fundamentally changed. He was given a minor acting role, playing a character named Arnie, but his real power was behind the scenes. Armed with Roseanne's absolute backing, Tom began to assert himself. He started changing scripts without consulting the head writers. He started confronting crew members in the hallways. He acted as Roseanne's personal enforcer. The writers and the crew were completely terrified. They were working long hours to produce a hit show, and suddenly they had to navigate a minefield. They could not complain to human resources about Tom's erratic behavior, his obvious substance issues, or his aggressive demands. Complaining about Tom meant going to war with Roseanne, and everyone in the building knew that the network would always side with Roseanne. The executives had already proven they would sacrifice anyone to keep her happy. Tom's physical presence on the set fed Roseanne's worst instincts. Before Tom arrived, she was a demanding star fighting for creative control. With Tom by her side, whispering in her ear and validating her paranoia, she began to transform into a tyrant. They isolated themselves in their dressing rooms, creating an echo chamber of suspicion. They convinced themselves that the highly educated writers were untalented hacks trying to ruin the show. They convinced themselves that the directors were secretly plotting against them. Tom would get angry about a perceived slight from a camera operator, and Roseanne would use her power to demand that person be fired. Roseanne would feel insecure about a storyline, and Tom would aggressively confront the writers to defend her honor. They became a single destructive unit operating inside a corporate machine that was too scared to turn them off. The studio lot was no longer a place of work. It was a kingdom ruled by fear. The network executives watched from a safe distance as the couple's behavior became increasingly volatile. They knew Tom was battling severe demons, and they knew Roseanne was enabling him while he enabled her paranoia. But as long as the final tape was delivered to the broadcast center on time, the executives looked the other way. They authorized the creation of a monster because it was profitable, completely ignoring the human cost of the environment they had built. In the early months of 1990, the American public was presented with a highly publicized television wedding. Roseanne Barr and Tom Arnold officially married, and the Hollywood public relations machine immediately went to work. The magazines and entertainment news shows sold the audience a heartwarming narrative. They framed it as a beautiful story of two working-class misfits, two people who did not fit the traditional glamorous Hollywood mold, finally finding true love and acceptance with each other. The public eagerly bought the story, but behind the closed doors of the studio executives, this marriage was not viewed as a romantic triumph. It was viewed as the most dangerous corporate merger in the history of the entertainment business. By legally binding themselves together, Roseanne and Tom effectively consolidated their power. They were no longer just a star and her boyfriend. They were a unified, untouchable monopoly operating right in the middle of the ABC network. The immediate result of this marriage was a total suffocating lockdown of the production set. Before the wedding, Tom was already a disruptive force, but there was always a faint, lingering hope among the crew that the relationship might end and he would leave. Once the rings were exchanged, that hope vanished entirely. Tom was now permanently cemented into the power structure. Roseanne demanded that her new husband be given absolute authority, essentially making him a co-ruler of the show. The network, terrified of losing their billion-dollar property, simply nodded and handed over the administrative keys. The couple turned the studio lot into their own private, highly guarded fortress. They isolated themselves in their offices, surrounding themselves only with people who were too afraid to tell them the truth. This deep isolation proved to be the perfect breeding ground for their shared demons. The marriage acted as an accelerant for Tom's severe dependency on chemical substances. With unlimited access to Roseanne's massive television fortune and absolutely no professional oversight, his addiction spiraled completely out of control. He was consuming vast amounts of illicit substances daily, which drastically altered his brain chemistry. The drugs made him hyper-aggressive. wildly unpredictable and deeply paranoid. He began to see enemies everywhere. He would misinterpret a casual glance from a camera operator as a sign of deep disrespect. He would read a script and decide the writers were secretly mocking him through the dialogue. This is where the lethal dynamic of their partnership truly activated. When Tom experienced these drug-induced bouts of paranoia, he did not keep them to himself. He brought them directly to Roseanne. Roseanne was already carrying her own massive burden of insecurity, constantly feeling judged by the Hollywood elite. When her husband came to her sweating and raging, telling her that the crew was plotting against them and that the writers were laughing at them behind their backs, she believed him completely. She took his chemical paranoia and treated it as absolute fact. His addiction fed her insecurity, and her immense corporate power gave his hallucinations real-world consequences. If Tom pointed at a crew member and said they were an enemy, Roseanne would use her leverage to have that person fired before the end of the day. They became a closed loop of madness, validating each other's worst fears and punishing anyone who stood in their way. By 1991, this toxic cycle found its ultimate target, the writing staff. The writer's room of any major television show is the intellectual engine of the production. The people who populated this room were highly educated, seasoned professionals. They were the exact type of people that Roseanne and Tom deeply resented. The couple looked at the writers and saw the educated establishment that had always looked down on them. They decided to break these people not just by firing them, but by systematically stripping away their human dignity. They instituted a regime of psychological warfare that remains infamous in Hollywood to this day. Roseanne and Tom decided that the writers did not deserve to have names. They ordered the production team to print custom T-shirts with large numbers on them. The highly paid, award-winning writing staff were forced to wear these numbered shirts while they worked. When the couple needed a script revision, they would refuse to call a writer by their given name. They would simply shout down the hallway for number 2 or number 6 to come to their office. This was a calculated, devastating method of dehumanization. It was designed to send a crystal-clear message to the staff. You are not artists, you are not collaborators, you are entirely replaceable factory workers, and you only exist because we allow you to exist. It was a daily exercise in breaking the spirits of intelligent people, just so Roseanne and Tom could feel a fleeting sense of superiority. The writers lived in a state of constant, suffocating fear. They knew that one wrong word, one joke that did not land perfectly, or one accidental sigh of frustration would trigger a massive explosion. The physical environment of the set became violent. Tom, heavily fueled by his addictions, would frequently fly into blind rages. He would scream inches from the faces of the staff and physically smash furniture, throwing chairs across the room when a rehearsal did not go his way. Roseanne would join in the chaos, firing people on a whim and creating an atmosphere where absolutely no one felt safe. The turnover rate for the crew was staggering. People were coming to work every day physically sick with anxiety, wondering if they would be the next target of the couple's wrath. The true villainy of this era does not just belong to Roseanne and Tom. It belongs equally to the corporate executives at the ABC network. The men in suits who ran the company knew exactly what was happening on their property. They received the frantic phone calls. They saw the rapid turnover. They paid the invoices to replace the furniture Tom destroyed in his drug-fueled tantrums. But the network actively chose to establish a legal blind spot. They refused to step in and stop the abuse. Instead of protecting their employees, the network acted as a high-priced cleanup crew for the couple's destructive behavior. When Roseanne and Tom illegally fired someone in a fit of rage, the network lawyers would silently step in. They would hand the fired employee a massive settlement check and force them to sign a strict non-disclosure agreement. The executives literally paid people to stay quiet about the psychological torture they had endured. The corporate logic was cold, ruthless, and entirely driven by the bottom line. As long as the ratings dominated the charts and the advertising revenue poured in, the executives did not care how many working-class crew members were traumatized. They protected the profits at the absolute expense of human safety. As the calendar moved into 1992, the contrast between the reality of the production and the illusion broadcast on television became deeply disturbing. This is the ultimate horrifying trick that the entertainment industry played on the public. Right outside the studio doors, the hallways reeked of chemical substances. People were crying in their cars. The environment was a nightmare of abuse and extortion. Yet the moment the director called for action, Roseanne and Tom would walk onto the brightly lit set and instantly transform. They would sit down at that iconic familiar kitchen table and deliver heartwarming moral lessons to the American public. They would look into the cameras and preach about family unity, honesty, and the value of hard work. They projected the image of a tough, loving family that millions of viewers trusted and relied upon for comfort. The audience sitting at home had absolutely no idea they were being manipulated. They were watching a wholesome family comedy, entirely unaware that the product was being manufactured in a literal war zone. The television network took the chaotic, drug-addled reality of Roseanne and Tom and fed it through the Hollywood machine, scrubbing it clean until it looked exactly like the American dream. They sold a comforting lie to the public to fund the destructive reality of two out-of-control billionaires, and they were willing to do whatever it took to keep that lie going. By 1993, the dynamic between the couple and the television network evolved into a situation entirely unprecedented in the history of the entertainment business. They had tested the structural fences of their corporate enclosure and realized the network executives had entirely surrendered. But unlimited power combined with severe chemical dependency creates a highly dangerous psychological void. Tom Arnold was heavily addicted to substances, but his deepest, most destructive addiction was his desperate need for industry validation. He was acutely aware of how the Hollywood elite viewed him. He knew the crew whispered about him in the hallways. He knew the media saw him as a talentless husband who had simply manipulated a powerful, insecure woman to secure a massive paycheck. This deep-seated insecurity ate away at him daily. He needed to prove to the establishment that he was a legitimate star in his own right, not just a parasitic attachment to a cultural icon. Roseanne, heavily driven by her fierce need to protect him and her overwhelming desire to humiliate the network executives she despised, decided to force the industry to bow down to him. They were no longer satisfied with controlling one dominant hit show. They wanted a complete network monopoly. The couple walked into the executive boardrooms and delivered a demand that defied all conventional business logic. They told the network that Tom Arnold required his own dedicated television series. He was not a proven actor. He had zero track record of carrying a narrative structure, and his public reputation was deeply controversial and actively hostile. In any normal corporate environment, a request to invest tens of millions of dollars into an unproven, highly volatile liability would be immediately laughed out of the room. But Roseanne held the ultimate trump card. The network executives knew that refusing her demand would trigger a catastrophic tantrum that could shut down their most profitable asset permanently. They were trapped in a cycle of corporate abuse that they had built themselves. To pacify their star, the network agreed to fund, produce, and heavily market an entire vanity project solely designed to soothe her husband's fragile ego. This specific transaction exposes the true cold-blooded cruelty of the Hollywood corporate system. The network executives did not greenlight the show because they believed in Tom's talent or because they wanted to provide quality entertainment to the American public. They did it entirely out of financial terror. They looked at their massive balance sheets and realized that burning millions of dollars on a doomed comedy project was simply a necessary insurance premium they had to pay to keep Roseanne showing up to work. They actively traded their corporate integrity for syndication security. The system is fundamentally ruthless because it completely abandons logic, fairness, and artistic merit the exact moment a powerful star threatens the profit margin. The executives allowed a man who was heavily under the influence of illicit substances to be handed the keys to a multi-million-dollar production simply because they were too cowardly to say no to his wife. They authorized a disaster to protect their bonuses. The new program was forced onto the television schedule. To ensure it did not immediately sink, Roseanne used her absolute leverage to place it directly after her own show on Tuesday nights. She was essentially holding her massive loyal audience hostage, forcing millions of working-class families to watch her husband's project by tying it to the program they actually loved. But the viewing public is not easily fooled by corporate scheduling tricks. The audience could instantly see the jarring difference between an authentic, working-class comedy and a chaotic vanity project. The show lacked heart, it lacked basic narrative structure, and most importantly, it relied entirely on a man whose severe chemical dependencies made his performance erratic and deeply uncomfortable to watch. The television ratings began to steadily and undeniably plummet. The forced audience quickly changed the channel the moment Roseanne's end credits rolled. The project was a massive critical and commercial failure, burning through network funds at an alarming rate. When the television network executives finally gathered the necessary courage to address the plummeting ratings, they gently suggested canceling the failing show to stop the financial bleeding. This polite, standard business suggestion triggered the most aggressive and blatant act of corporate extortion in the history of modern television. Roseanne did not offer to renegotiate their contracts. She did not offer to bring in better writers to retool the failing project. She delivered a direct, brutal, and non-negotiable threat. She informed the highest-ranking executives that if they pulled the plug on her husband's show, she would immediately stop showing up to work. She explicitly threatened to pack up her billion-dollar franchise, break every legal contract she had signed, and take her hit show directly to a rival network. She put a loaded gun to the head of the entire corporation and dared them to pull the trigger. Faced with the absolute destruction of their primetime schedule and the terrifying prospect of losing hundreds of millions of dollars in future advertising revenue, the corporate executives completely surrendered their remaining dignity. They bowed their heads and agreed to keep a failing, money-losing television show on the air simply to satisfy the aggressive delusions of their star. They proved to the industry that there is absolutely no limit to what Hollywood will tolerate if the financial stakes are high enough. The network swallowed the massive financial loss and continued to broadcast a show nobody wanted to watch, solidifying their role as willing hostages to a drug-fueled dictatorship. But this massive victory over the network was actually a poison pill for the marriage. Securing the show through blatant blackmail did not cure Tom's deep insecurities. It magnified them. He knew deep down that he had not earned the television show through his own talent. He knew the network executives hated him and that the public was actively rejecting him every Tuesday night. This crushing realization drove him much further into his severe substance abuse. He began to spiral completely out of control, heavily relying on chemicals to numb the humiliation of his public failure. He became increasingly paranoid, volatile, and impossible to manage, bringing that chaotic energy back into their shared home and on to the studio lot. Roseanne, meanwhile, was absorbing an impossible, crushing amount of psychological pressure. She was carrying the creative weight of a massive television empire, constantly fighting brutal wars with the network executives. And now she was forced to physically and emotionally prop up a husband who was visibly falling apart under the pressure of his own failing show. The intense paranoia and us against the world mentality that had originally united them began to slowly turn inward. The heavy fortress they had built to keep the Hollywood establishment out was now trapping them inside with each other. The heavy drug use amplified their worst character traits. Every minor disagreement about a script or a lighting cue escalated into a massive, screaming betrayal. The very power they had extorted from the network was creating a volatile pressure cooker. The deep trust that had formed the foundation of their dangerous alliance was rapidly evaporating, setting the stage for a spectacular and violent internal collapse that the network could no longer cover up. By the early months of 1994, the fortress that Roseanne Barr and Tom Arnold had built to keep the Hollywood establishment out had successfully transformed into a highly funded prison. They were trapped inside a multi-million-dollar mansion, entirely isolated from reality. The intense, aggressive unity that had allowed them to extort the television network had completely dissolved into deep, chemical-induced suspicion. When you build an empire entirely on paranoia, that paranoia eventually needs a target. With the network executives completely subdued and the writing staff thoroughly terrorized, the couple had no one left to fight but each other. The daily reality of their marriage devolved into a terrifying cycle of severe substance abuse, massive ego clashes, and mutual distrust. Tom Arnold's chemical dependency had reached a critical, unsustainable threshold. The illicit substances were no longer just a reckless Hollywood habit. They were entirely dictating his brain functions and his daily behavior. The cancellation of his vanity project had deeply humiliated him in front of the entire industry, and he used those substances to completely numb the sting of his public failure. He became wildly erratic. He would pace the hallways of their home and the studio lot, convinced that invisible enemies were plotting to strip him of his power. He began to suspect that Roseanne herself was conspiring with the network executives behind his back to remove him from the television show. The man who had once been her fiercest protector and her loyal enforcer had mutated into an unpredictable, dangerous liability. Roseanne was simultaneously being crushed by the immense, unrelenting pressure of carrying $1 billion corporate asset. She was the singular face of a massive franchise. The network relied entirely on her to deliver the ratings every Tuesday night, and that pressure was absolute. For years, she had used her massive leverage to shield Tom from the consequences of his actions. She had fired innocent people to soothe his ego. She had extorted the executives to buy him a television show. But as his behavior became completely unmanageable, a cold, ruthless survival instinct kicked in. She looked at her husband and realized that his spiraling addiction was no longer just a personal tragedy. It was actively threatening the stability of her television empire. And in the brutal mathematics of Hollywood, the empire always comes first. The realization that the marriage was over did not result in a quiet, mutually respectful separation. In the entertainment industry, when a powerful figure decides to sever a tie, they do not negotiate. They execute a corporate purge. Roseanne understood exactly how much power the ABC network had handed her over the past 5 years. She decided to weaponize that exact same dictatorial power to entirely obliterate the man who had helped her build it. She recognized that Tom's entire identity, his immense wealth, and his terrifying authority on the studio lot were not his own. They were entirely derived from her. She had given him the keys to the kingdom, and in April of 1994, she decided to violently snatch them back. She filed for divorce, but she did not stop at the legal paperwork. She initiated a brutal, immediate physical expulsion. Without any prior warning, she fired him from his highly lucrative position as executive producer on her television show. She instantly ordered the network to strip his name from the production credits. She systematically dismantled his professional existence in a matter of hours. But Roseanne knew Tom's volatile nature better than anyone. She knew he would not simply accept a pink slip and walk away quietly. She understood the physical reality of the studio lot, and she knew she had to establish a hard, physical boundary to enforce his exile. To execute this, she bypassed standard human resources protocols and mobilized a private, heavily armed security force. She hired private guards and stationed them directly at the main entrance gates of the CBS Studio Center where the sitcom was filmed. They were given explicit, non-negotiable orders directly from the star of the show. Tom Arnold was permanently, irrevocably banned from the premises. If he drove up to the gate, he was to be turned away. If he attempted to physically enter the lot, the guards were instructed to physically remove him. The psychological devastation of this moment for Tom Arnold was absolute. He had spent the last 4 years walking through those exact same studio gates as a conquering king. He was the man who made highly paid writers tremble in fear. He was the man who screamed at producers and smashed furniture while network executives looked the other way. He had genuinely convinced himself that he possessed real, tangible power within the Hollywood system. But the moment his car was stopped by armed guards at the gate, the devastating truth crashed down on him. The power was never real. It was a complete illusion. He was never a Hollywood titan. He was simply a temporary, highly destructive guest who had suddenly overstayed his welcome. He was stripped of his title, his access, and his dignity in a single afternoon. He was left standing on the wrong side of a locked gate, entirely expunged from the system he had ruthlessly dominated. The most revealing and chilling aspect of this entire brutal purge was the reaction of the ABC network executives. The men in expensive suits who had spent half a decade cowering in fear before Tom Arnold, the executives who had allowed him to mentally abuse their writing staff and extort their corporate finances, did absolutely nothing to intervene. They watched the armed security guards turn him away from the lot, and they maintained a cold, calculated, dead silence. This silence exposes the absolute bloodless cruelty of the corporate television structure. The executives never had any genuine loyalty to Tom. They had never respected him, and they had certainly never cared about his severe substance abuse issues. Their loyalty was entirely exclusively tethered to the Nielsen ratings that Roseanne generated. The network had tolerated Tom's screaming matches, his drug use, and his vanity projects strictly as a necessary business expense. He was simply the cost of doing business with their biggest star. The exact second Roseanne decided that Tom was no longer useful to her, the network instantly agreed. They discarded him like a piece of broken machinery. They did not offer him a severance package. They did not offer him a place in a rehabilitation facility. They coldly and efficiently erased him from their balance sheets. The corporate executives were secretly relieved that the volatile, unpredictable half of their daily nightmare had been neutralized by the golden goose herself. They did not have to get their hand dirty. They simply locked the doors and let the couple destroy each other. The marriage had been violently severed, but the war was far from over. The internal collapse of their relationship merely shifted the battlefield. They were no longer fighting behind the closed, soundproof doors of a television soundstage. The armed guards at the studio gate forced the conflict out into the open. Stripped of his corporate shield and backed into a corner, Tom realized his only remaining weapon was the unvarnished truth. And Roseanne, determined to control the narrative just as she controlled her scripts, prepared to launch a massive media offensive. They were about to drag their drug-fueled, deeply toxic nightmare directly into the public eye, initiating a vicious, scorched earth press campaign that would force the American audience to finally see the ugly, undeniable reality hiding behind the comforting facade of their favorite working-class family. The physical expulsion of Tom Arnold from the studio lot was merely the opening shot in what would quickly become the most vicious, uncontained media war of the 1990s. For 5 years, the couple had used their combined terrifying authority to force the television network into absolute silence. They had successfully built a massive corporate dam to hold back the reality of their drug-fueled, abusive environment from the American public. But the moment Roseanne deployed armed guards to lock her husband out of his own kingdom, that dam completely shattered. The battleground immediately shifted from the soundproof production offices in Los Angeles to the front pages of national magazines, tabloid newspapers, and evening television broadcasts across the globe. Roseanne was a master of reading an audience, and she understood the mechanics of the Hollywood public relations machine better than anyone in the industry. She knew that in a massive public scandal, the person who strikes first controls the narrative. She did not want a quiet, dignified legal separation handled behind closed doors. She wanted absolute, scorched earth public annihilation. Before Tom could even secure proper legal representation or process the shock of his sudden exile, Roseanne went directly to the press. She launched a massive, highly coordinated media offensive designed to completely rewrite the history of the past 5 years. She stood in front of the cameras and accused him of severe physical and emotional abuse. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a man entirely consumed by his cocaine addiction. She alleged that he had systematically manipulated her, terrorized her, and siphoned off millions of dollars of her hard-earned television fortune to fund his illicit lifestyle. The brilliance and the sheer ruthlessness of her strategy was how she actively framed her own role. She did not present herself as a willing co-conspirator in their toxic empire. She completely erased the fact that she had personally enabled him, demanded his hiring, and used him as a blunt instrument to terrorize the network executives. Instead, she presented herself to the public as the ultimate helpless victim of a drug-addled con artist who had hijacked her life, her finances, and her show. Tom Arnold found himself in a terrifying, completely unprecedented position. He was suddenly stripped of all his corporate power. He was cut off from the massive network salaries. He was completely exiled from the studio lot where he used to strike fear into the hearts of seasoned producers. And now he was facing a massive public relations assault from one of the most powerful women in the world. He quickly realized that the network executives who used to laugh at his jokes and fulfill his demands were not going to step in to save him. The Hollywood establishment had entirely abandoned him. Backed into a corner with his reputation in absolute ruins, Tom realized his only remaining weapon was the unvarnished truth. He could no longer rely on the corporate machine to protect him, so he went directly to the media to expose the sheer, undeniable madness of the life they had shared. Tom fought back by pulling the curtain all the way back on the Roseanne empire. He detailed the extreme, suffocating paranoia that dictated their daily lives. He exposed the horrifying truth about the lockdown dressing rooms. He went on the record about the ruthless, sadistic firing of the writing staff. He told the public about the numbered t-shirts they forced the writers to wear, exposing the atmosphere of absolute terror they had jointly created on the set. He made it very clear to the public that Roseanne was not a helpless, terrified victim trapped in a bad marriage. He presented her as a fully active, willing participant in the chaos. He argued that she had used his severe chemical addiction as a weapon, winding him up and pointing him at the network executives to enforce her own dictatorial rule. This was mutually assured destruction executed by two people who had built a billion-dollar empire on a foundation of shared insecurity. They knew exactly where to strike, to inflict the maximum amount of psychological damage because they had spent half a decade isolating themselves from the rest of the world. They knew every buried scandal, every corporate cover-up, and every illegal firing. as they traded vicious accusations in magazines and television interviews throughout late 1994 and 1995. They systematically dismantled each other's credibility. For the working class viewers sitting at home, the cognitive dissonance was staggering. This was the exact demographic that had deeply trusted the television show. Millions of families had tuned in every single week to watch a relatable, struggling mother navigate the challenges of poverty, bad jobs, and raising children. They believed in the Connor family. Now they were forced to watch that same relatable mother engage in a grotesque multi-million-dollar tabloid war. The comforting illusion of the warm, inviting television kitchen was violently shattered by the reality of heavy drug allegations, armed guards, and stolen fortunes. The audience was brutally confronted with the fact that the person they viewed as a national hero for the working class was, in reality, a ruthless Hollywood titan settling personal vendettas in the press. The comforting lie they had consumed for years was unraveling right in front of their eyes. They realized the woman on the screen complaining about the price of groceries was actually fighting over an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The profound connection between the star and her audience was fundamentally and permanently broken. The most chilling aspect of this entire public spectacle was the reaction of the American Broadcasting Company. The network executives, the high-priced producers, and the Hollywood elite who had actively enabled this toxic marriage for 5 years suddenly vanished. They stepped entirely into the shadows and closed their doors. The same men who had allowed Tom Arnold to terrorize their staff, the same corporate suits who had paid off fired writers and covered up the rampant drug use on their own property, maintained a cold, calculated silence. They did not issue statements defending their star. They did not launch internal investigations into the allegations of severe workplace abuse that were now being broadcast on national television. They simply stood back and watched two of their former moneymakers tear each other to pieces. This bloodless silence revealed the darkest, most unforgiving rule of the entertainment industry. The corporate system does not possess a moral compass. It only reads a balance sheet. The network's complete abandonment of Tom Arnold proved that his power was never real. His authority only existed because Roseanne demanded it, and the network tolerated him strictly as a business expense to keep their star showing up to work. The exact second he lost his leverage with Roseanne, he ceased to exist in the eyes of the corporation. They threw him to the wolves without a single moment of hesitation. They did not care about the truth of the abuse allegations or the reality of the toxic work environment they had funded. Their only concern was ensuring that the negative press did not permanently damage the advertising rates for the upcoming season. In fact, the executives coldly calculated that the massive tabloid spectacle might even drive up the viewership numbers out of sheer morbid curiosity. They had exploited the marriage when it was profitable, and they exploited the divorce when it became a public circus. When the television show finally resumed production without Tom, the atmosphere on the set and the narrative on the screen shifted dramatically. For years, the couple had fueled each other's paranoia and aggression, using their combined weight as a blunt weapon against the network. Now, entirely isolated at the top without her primary enforcer, Roseanne's absolute creative control led the program into increasingly bizarre and disconnected territory. The ultimate reflection of her detachment from reality occurred in the show's final season. The struggling working-class family suddenly won a massive, multi-million-dollar state lottery. The gritty paycheck-to-paycheck survival stories that had defined the show and resonated so deeply with the public were abruptly abandoned. They were replaced by absurd, disconnected plots about wealthy elites, high society parties, and rubbing shoulders with celebrities. This creative pivot was not just a poor writing choice, it was the undeniable reality of the leading lady bleeding directly onto the screen. She could no longer authentically portray a struggling blue-collar mother because she had spent the last decade operating as an untouchable, incredibly wealthy corporate tyrant. The system had made her a billionaire, and she had completely lost touch with the very demographic she was supposed to represent. The mask had completely slipped, and the audience could finally see the cold corporate reality operating behind the jokes. The ultimate unspoken tragedy of this entire saga is the absolute lack of corporate accountability. When the sitcom finally concluded its original run, the network executives faced zero consequences for the horrifying environment they had actively facilitated. There were no industry investigations into the psychological torture and mass firings of the writing staff. There were no legal penalties for placing a man with a severe, publicly acknowledged addiction into a position of absolute authority over hundreds of crew members. The executives simply calculated their final syndication profits, packed up the soundstage, and moved on to the next highly profitable project. They had successfully navigated the most dangerous, volatile marriage in television history without losing their core advertising base. In the eyes of the Hollywood system, they had executed their jobs perfectly. The system proved that it will gladly tolerate psychological abuse, blatant corporate extortion, and rampant drug use on its own sets, provided the television ratings remain dominant. The executives traded the physical and mental safety of their employees for a reliable revenue stream, validating the destructive behavior of their stars every step of the way. The legacy of this television partnership stands as a chilling testament to the dangers of unchecked corporate enabling. Their relationship was not a romantic union. It was a hostile corporate takeover executed by two people bonded by shared trauma and deep-seated paranoia. They recognized the inherent cowardice of the television industry and weaponized it to build a personal dictatorship. They proved that a network will readily surrender its dignity, betray its working-class employees, and lie directly to its audience to protect its bottom line. The story of this marriage is the definitive unmasking of the television industry. It serves as a permanent forensic reminder that the most comforting, wholesome images broadcast into our homes are frequently manufactured by a system that is fundamentally ruthless and entirely devoid of empathy. Tell us in the comments below which industry legend we should examine next. Until then, remember that the most dramatic, destructive scripts are never the ones written for the cameras. They are the ones executed in the boardrooms.